Saints in Christ, grace to you and peace from God our Creator and Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. Sitting in a basket in our living room, I found a Man's Elementary library book from the nonfiction section all about fairies. From the nonfiction section, all about fairies. Okay? I think it's because it's informational, not a story. And in it, flipping through it with Maida, I learned that there are lots of different kinds of fairies, like woodland fairies and water fairies. And that once, long ago, many people, to explain natural phenomenon, would say that these mystical nymphs were to blame. We might smile at that now, but it's not too different from when people used to say that people with a mental illness had a demon, is it? Or when women who were a bit too nonconformist were tried as witches, right? Science and psychology and reason have brought us into a very different kind of world in 2019, haven't they? A world in which a scene like we heard from Revelation with its fantastic beast and its creatures and the lamb on the throne and a scene in heaven, it could just seem like it belongs to the Marvel universe instead of this one. Or we hear a story like the one I just told from ancient Joppa about a woman who was dead and brought back to life. It could seem to our modern ears unreal at best, and at worst, cruelly random, and something that certainly God doesn't do today. Because whether we know it or not, in 2019, we are, all of us, very affected by an egg, a certain egg. I don't mean an Easter egg or a breakfast egg, but one that sat on a wall and had a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Yeah. And that's just the way it is. Things get broken that can't be fixed. People become sick, and there isn't a cure. Some have power, many do not. Violence persists, people die. That's just the way the world is. Until it isn't. Let's go back to Joppa for a little while. Joppa, remember, was Jonah's whole hometown in the Old Testament. It's a real town with a real person called Tabitha. I prefer the Greek, Dorcas, because I find the name ironic. Also, it was the name of my third grade teacher, Dorcas Gravely. So Dorcas lived there. And I want to pause with the very first thing we learn about her. It says she was a disciple. She was a disciple. Now, today we celebrate mothers, or those who have been mothers to us. And I've never met a mother who didn't want to raise a strong girl, to raise a daughter with the capacity to make a difference or be a leader. And yet, the Global Gender Gap Report of 2018 says that out of 150 countries benchmarked, the U.S. ranks 49th. 49th in that gender gap. Could this be because of a Christian-based interpretation about leadership gone wrong? I don't know. But I just want to point out that in the first century, no mincing the Greek, no mincing the English, Dorcas was a disciple. Can I get an amen? Amen. Mm-hmm. So Dorcas was a disciple, but she died, and then she didn't stay dead. There's a few details in between. See, not all women in the Bible get named. They don't. And so you wonder, was she kind of a big deal? That she does? Was she one of those wealthy women who had enough means to support a house church? Or was her brother somebody important like Miriam, and Moses? Or was she married to someone important like Esther, who became a queen? It doesn't seem like that from this short story. No, there's actually no family mentioned here with Dorcas, which is odd. Because in other kind of resurrection stories, there's always family around. There's Jairus' daughter, Peter's mother-in-law, Lazarus' sisters. But there's no family here. There's just a bunch of widows. There's widows who are standing around weeping. And one thing you wonder, or if you know the context, you wonder, are they the professional mourners who are paid to be there? Because it's a little odd, but that was a thing. People were paid to come and publicly mourn loudly when someone died. So is that what those widows were doing? It doesn't seem so. Because it says that they were actually wearing some of the clothes that Dorcas had made, and they were showing these tunics, and they were crying in a way that showed that this was personal. They knew them. They knew her. Perhaps she was one of them, a widow herself. Either way, they were part of this Christian community. A Christian community who, upon her death, decided they would send two men to a nearby town of Lydda. Now, Lydda is 11 miles away. And I don't know how you define nearby, but I'd like to ask any of those marathoners from last weekend if at mile 22 that felt like a nearby jaunt, right? But that's what they did. They went 11 miles one way to find Peter, came 11 miles back for this woman who was a widow, probably of very little means. And I asked myself, why? Why did they do this? She must have meant something to them. She must have been like a pillar in their small community or a leader, you know? And they were a little bit crazy about her, I think. And a little bit crazy in their trust of Jesus because they hoped on a miracle. And then that miracle came. But we say, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses, all the king's men couldn't put him together again. Things do get broken that don't get fixed. Justice doesn't come. Death happens. That's the way it is. Until it isn't. Because of the power of God. Rachel Held Evans was an author and blogger who passed away this week. And I love these words that she uses to talk about the power of this God. She says this, we could not become like God, so God became like us. God showed us how to heal instead of kill, how to mend instead of destroy, how to love instead of hate, how to live instead of long for more. When we nailed God to a tree, God forgave, and when we buried God in the ground, God got up. God got up. Death and sin, the grave, hatred, injustice, they were what they were until they weren't. Until they didn't have to be, because of Jesus, who didn't stay dead. Because of communities who gathered in his name, because of communities through whom that same resurrection power began to work. I've been thinking about this story and wondering, what if the miracle wasn't because of Peter? What if the miracle wasn't because he had some kind of magic fingers or he was super special because of his proxy to Jesus? What if the miracle happened because of this community? A community who yearned for a hopeful outcome, who had lovingly cared for a body, who had shed communal tears, who had sent runners on a fool's errand and waited outside a door in hope. These people, we could call them crazy or audacious. We would dismiss them today perhaps like those who believe in fairies or visions, or maybe these were the first Easter people. This was the first community of Easter people who had reason to believe in a God who transcends the categories of birth, life, and death. What if these were the first Easter people who had reason to believe in a God who transcends our categories of birth, life, and death? Because the faith that we confess is that because of Easter, there is a new hope that can birth a new kind of community among us. Where the political climate would have us seem divided, we gather at a table in community, in communion. Where the world would try to label us as a success or a failure, as authentic or fake, in baptism we're named beloved. And that is enough. And when we think we have come to an end of a story and we've prayed for a cure that does not come, God breaks in with healing. With healing in maybe 100 different ways that we didn't know were possible. Because Easter people have reason to believe in a God who transcends our boundaries, and we can live as if that were true in a radical kind of freedom. What would an Easter community look like in Eau Claire? It might look like prayer shawls, prayer partners, healing services and homebound visitation, mentoring youth and honoring our elders. Someday, yes, that vision from Revelation will be true, that God will gather and shelter and wipe away every tear. But in the meantime, we have one another, for whom we can do small things with great love, just like Dorcas did. We can live in a crazy, audacious trust and hope in this resurrection power. We can believe that something else is possible through Christ. That's the way that it is. Amen.